One moment, one city, 5 catastrophic mistakes that nobody saw coming. The assassination in Sarajevo, 5 mistakes that started a world war. What if one decision had been different? What if one person had looked left instead of right? Everything changes in seconds. Subscribe for more untold stories that shaped history. On the morning of June the 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary arrived in Sarajevo for a state visit. It was meant to be a routine diplomatic engagement in a restless provincial capital. Instead, it would become the moment when a single assassination unraveled the delicate web of European alliances and triggered a cascade of decisions that plunged the world into unprecedented catastrophe. The story of how World War I began is not one of grand strategic designs or inevitable historical forces. It is a story of 5 critical mistakes, moments where different choices might have altered the entire course of the 20th century. A miscalculated security route, a bomb that failed to detonate as intended, a wrong turn down a Sarajevo street, a young assassin with a pistol and a second chance he never expected to receive, and finally, a series of diplomatic ultimatums and military mobilizations that transformed a regional crisis into global conflict. Behind these events stood the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist organization founded in May of 1911, whose members believed that violence could reshape the Balkans. Their conspiracy set in motion events that no one fully controlled or comprehended. What began as an assassination in a Bosnian city would eventually claim millions of lives across 4 continents and reshape the political landscape of the modern world. This is how it happened. This is how a wrong turn changed everything. The Balkans in the spring of 1914 were a powder keg wrapped in diplomatic pleasantries. To understand how the assassination would unfold, one must first understand the world that produced it, a world of colliding empires, nationalist fervor, and a generation of young men willing to die for causes larger than themselves. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched across Central Europe like a fading giant, its vast territories held together more by bureaucratic tradition than genuine unity. Within its borders lived dozens of ethnic groups speaking different languages, practicing different faiths, and harboring different dreams of independence. The Balkans represented the empire's most unstable periphery, where South Slavic nationalism burned with particular intensity. Serbia, independent since 1878, had become the symbolic heart of South Slavic aspirations, a beacon for Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians who chafed under Austro-Hungarian rule. This was the political landscape that gave birth to the Black Hand. In May of 1911, in the Serbian capital of Belgrade, a secret military organization emerged from the shadows. Known formally as Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, Union or Death, it would come to be called simply the Black Hand, a name drawn from its emblem, a skull and crossbones superimposed over a dagger. The organization's founder was Dragutin Dimitrijević, known to his associates as Apis, a nickname derived from the Egyptian bull god. Apis was a major in the Serbian military intelligence service, a man of considerable influence within Serbia's military establishment and a passionate believer in Serbian nationalist ideology. The Black Hand's constitution was distributed in careful, handwritten copies to its members. It was a document written in the language of revolutionary fervor and nationalist mysticism. The organization's stated purpose was the unification of all South Slavs under Serbian leadership, the liberation of Serbian territories from Austro-Hungarian control, and the establishment of a greater Serbian state. But the methods outlined in its constitution went far beyond political persuasion or diplomatic negotiation. The Black Hand was fundamentally an organization committed to conspiracy, infiltration, and violence. Membership in the Black Hand required an oath of absolute secrecy and obedience. Members swore to place the organization's goals above all other loyalties, including family and the Serbian state itself. The organization's structure was deliberately compartmentalized, with most members knowing only their immediate associates. This cellular structure made it difficult for authorities to penetrate, but it also meant that the organization could pursue objectives that its own government might deny knowledge of, a characteristic that would prove historically significant. Among the Black Hand's membership were Serbian military officers, journalists, politicians, and intellectuals. By 1914, the organization boasted perhaps 2,000 members, though exact numbers remain uncertain. More important than its size was its strategic position within Serbian society. The Black Hand had influence in the military, connections to the government, and the ideological commitment to pursue objectives that official Serbian policy might officially disavow. This duality between official Serbian government positions and the Black Hand's covert operations would prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. The Serbian government could maintain plausible deniability, while nationalist conspirators pursued their objectives in the shadows. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories that Austria-Hungary had annexed in 1908 despite international objection, the nationalist fervor was equally intense. The annexation had shocked the Balkans and humiliated Serbia, which had hoped to acquire these territories itself. For young Bosnian Serbs, the annexation represented the closing of a door, the apparent impossibility of liberation through conventional means. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and nationalist passion that a small group of conspirators began planning an action that would change history. Gavrilo Princip was born in 1913 in the village of Obljaj in Bosnia, a remote settlement in a region of deep Balkan valleys and mountains. His father, Petar Princip, was a postman, a modest position that placed the family in the lower reaches of the middle class. The Princip household was strict and austere. Gavrilo was the fourth of 6 children, a sensitive and serious boy in a family that valued discipline and duty above emotional expression. From his earliest years, Gavrilo was exposed to nationalist ideology. His father harbored deep resentment toward Austro-Hungarian rule, and conversations at the family table often turned to the sufferings of the Serbian people and the dream of liberation. When Gavrilo was old enough to attend school, he excelled academically, particularly in literature and history. Teachers noted that he was intelligent and thoughtful, but also withdrawn and prone to intense emotional states. In 1911, at the age of 15, Gavrilo moved to Sarajevo to continue his education at the Merchants' Gymnasium, one of the city's most prestigious schools. Sarajevo was the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a city of cultural complexity where Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Balkan influences mingled in the streets and bazaars. It was a city of considerable beauty. The Miljacka River ran through its center, surrounded by mosques with their distinctive minarets, Catholic churches, Orthodox churches, and synagogues, standing as monuments to the region's religious diversity. But for young Serbian nationalists like Gavrilo, Sarajevo was also a symbol of oppression. The Austro-Hungarian administration was visible everywhere, in the official buildings, in the uniforms of the police and military, in the regulations that governed daily life. The city represented both the sophistication and the injustice of the empire that ruled over them. In Sarajevo, Gavrilo's nationalist convictions deepened. He joined a student nationalist organization called Mlada Bosna, Young Bosnia, which advocated for South Slavic independence and the unification of Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians. The organization was less formally structured than the Black Hand, but equally passionate in its commitment to liberation. Mlada Bosna attracted intellectuals, students, and idealistic young people who believed that the existing political order was fundamentally unjust and that dramatic action might be necessary to change it. Gavrilo's health during these years was fragile. He suffered from tuberculosis, a disease that was endemic in the Balkans and that killed thousands annually. The illness left him thin and pale, often coughing, frequently feverish. Yet his physical weakness seemed only to intensify his emotional passion. He became increasingly preoccupied with questions of sacrifice, duty, and the possibility that a young man might dedicate his life, or end it, for a cause greater than himself. In 1913, Gavrilo left Sarajevo for Belgrade, ostensibly to continue his education, but actually to deepen his involvement in nationalist circles. In Belgrade, he came into contact with members of the Black Hand and with other revolutionary circles. He was introduced to men who had fought in the Balkan Wars, who had killed for nationalist causes, and who believed that violence was a legitimate tool of liberation. These men recognized in Gavrilo a young person of serious conviction and burning intensity. It was during this period that the idea first emerged of assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Franz Ferdinand represented the future of Austro-Hungarian rule in the Balkans. His death, conspirators believed, might destabilize the empire, might trigger a crisis that could be exploited by Serbian nationalists and their allies. The idea was not unique to Gavrilo or even to the Black Hand. Various nationalist groups had contemplated such actions. But in early 1914, the idea began to crystallize into planning. The Archduke had announced his intention to visit Bosnia and Herzegovina in June of 1914, traveling to Sarajevo for military maneuvers and a state visit. The announcement was made public months in advance, and it immediately captured the attention of nationalist conspirators. Here was an opportunity, a predictable schedule, a defined location, and a target of immense symbolic importance. If the assassination could be carried out, it would send a message that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was vulnerable, that its rule in the Balkans could be challenged through dramatic action. The planning that followed involved multiple actors across different organizations and countries. Gavrilo was identified as a potential assassin. young, committed, willing to die for the cause, but he would not act alone. A network of conspirators was assembled, including other young Bosnian Serbs with nationalist convictions, members of the Black Hand, and possibly officials in the Serbian government who may have known of the plot or at least turned a blind eye to its development. The conspirators acquired weapons, primarily small bombs and pistols. These weapons were smuggled from Serbia into Bosnia through networks that suggest coordination with Serbian military or intelligence officials. Exactly which Serbian officials knew of the plot remains a matter of historical debate. Some evidence suggests that APIS and the Black Hand leadership were aware of the conspiracy, though whether they actively authorized it or merely permitted it to proceed remains unclear. Other evidence suggests that the Serbian government, under Prime Minister Nikola Pasic, may have learned of the plot and attempted to prevent it, though these efforts apparently failed. What is clear is that by June of 1914, a conspiracy was in motion. Multiple young men had been recruited and armed. Plans had been made to position assassins along the Archduke's route through Sarajevo. The conspirators believed that they were participating in a historical moment, that their actions would advance the cause of Serbian liberation and South Slavic independence. The broader context of this conspiracy was the deteriorating state of European peace. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary and Italy were locked in a system of alliances that created a kind of diplomatic stalemate. Germany and Austria-Hungary were allied with Italy in the Triple Alliance, France and Russia were allied with each other, and both were aligned with Britain in an informal understanding. The Balkans were the region where these great power interests most directly collided. Austria-Hungary viewed Serbian nationalism as an existential threat, a force that could unravel the empire by inspiring its South Slavic subjects to demand independence. Russia, by contrast, saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and as a counterweight to Austro-Hungarian expansion. Serbia was aligned with Russia, receiving military aid and diplomatic support. The situation was inherently unstable, a region where local conflicts could easily trigger great power intervention. The Austro-Hungarian government was well aware of the threat posed by Serbian nationalism. In 1908, when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, the move had been partly motivated by a desire to prevent these territories from falling under Serbian control. The annexation had humiliated Serbia and had intensified Serbian nationalist demands for the liberation of South Slavic territories. In the years between 1908 and 1914, Austro-Hungarian officials had become increasingly convinced that a confrontation with Serbia was inevitable and perhaps necessary. Against this background of imperial competition, nationalist fervor, and deteriorating diplomatic relations, the conspirators in Sarajevo prepared for June of 1914. They did not understand that their actions would trigger a cascade of events that would eventually destroy four empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, and the German, and would kill millions of people across the continent. What they understood was simpler and more immediate. They were young men living under foreign rule, and they believed that dramatic action was necessary to change their circumstances. They did not have to believe in the inevitability of world war. They only had to believe in the justice of their cause and in their willingness to sacrifice themselves for it. As spring turned to early summer in 1914, Sarajevo prepared for the arrival of the Archduke. The city's Austro-Hungarian administration made security preparations. The police force was alerted. Military units were positioned throughout the city. Yet the conspirators had positioned themselves as well, waiting along the streets where the Archduke would travel, armed and ready to strike. The stage was set for an event that would transform the history of the 20th century. The actors were in place, the weapons were distributed, the ideology that would justify the violence was deeply embedded in the minds of young men who believed they were fighting for freedom against imperial oppression. What neither the conspirators nor the great power governments understood was how the events of the next few weeks would unfold, how a single assassination would trigger a chain reaction of decisions and mobilizations that would lead inexorably toward continental war. The city of Sarajevo in the spring of 1914 was a place of contradictions, a crossroads where Ottoman decline met Austro-Hungarian expansion, where Slavic nationalism burned against imperial bureaucracy. The capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina had been under Austro-Hungarian control for 36 years, since the occupation of 1878, yet it remained a city profoundly at odds with its rulers. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched across Central Europe and the Balkans like an aging monarch clinging to territories it could no longer fully command. Sarajevo itself was a jewel the empire had never quite managed to fully possess, not in spirit, not in the hearts of its people. To understand the events that would unfold on the 28th of June, one must first understand the young man who would become history's most consequential assassin. Gavrilo Princip was 19 years old in 1914, a teenager whose life embodied the fervent nationalism that gripped the Balkans. Born in 1894 in a small village in Bosnia, Princip came from modest means, the son of a postal official. He was thin, tubercular, prone to illness, yet possessed of an intensity that burned through his frail frame. By all accounts, he was neither a natural criminal nor a hardened radical. He was an idealist, a nationalist, a young man who had absorbed the revolutionary fervor of his generation. Princip had spent time in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, where he had encountered the swirling currents of Balkan politics and revolutionary thought. It was in Belgrade, scholars believe, where he first became involved with the conspiracy that would change the world. The organization known as Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, which translates to Union or Death, had been founded in May of 1911 by Dragutin Dimitrijević, a colonel in the Serbian military intelligence service. Dimitrijević, known by the nickname Apis, was a man of profound nationalist conviction and questionable ethics. The Black Hand, as the organization came to be known in the West, was ostensibly dedicated to the liberation of South Slavic peoples from Austro-Hungarian rule. Its constitution, circulated among its members in secret, spoke of uniting all South Slavic territories and peoples under a single state. But scholars debate the organization's true nature and the extent of its official involvement in planning major operations. What is certain is that the Black Hand attracted young, idealistic nationalists like Princip, men who saw violence as a justified tool in the struggle for national liberation. The organization's methods were conspiratorial and often violent. It operated in the shadows of Serbian political life, wielding influence through fear and nationalist fervor. Its membership included military officers, intellectuals, and radical youth. The exact size of the Black Hand remains contested among historians, with estimates ranging widely, but contemporary sources suggest it included perhaps 200 to 300 members at its height. These were not uniformed soldiers, but secret operatives, committed to a vision of South Slavic unity that could only be achieved, they believed, through the removal of Austro-Hungarian power from the Balkans. By 1914, tensions between Serbia and Austria-Hungary had reached a fever pitch. The two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had demonstrated that Ottoman power was crumbling, and the question of who would control the territories being vacated was becoming increasingly urgent. Austria-Hungary viewed Serbian expansion with alarm. Serbia, by contrast, saw in the Balkans an opportunity to create a greater South Slavic state that might eventually unite all South Slavic peoples. The Austro-Hungarian Empire could not tolerate such ambitions on its borders. The two nations were locked in a struggle for dominance in a region that would determine the future of Eastern Europe. It was against this backdrop of imperial tension and nationalist fervor that the assassination plot took shape. The exact origins of the conspiracy remain somewhat unclear, with historians disagreeing on how much planning occurred and at what level of Serbian government, if any, official sanction was given. What is documented is that in the spring of 1914, several young Bosnian Serbs, including Princip, obtained weapons and explosives with the apparent intention of striking a blow against Austro-Hungarian rule. Some evidence suggests involvement by elements within Serbian military intelligence, though the full extent of such involvement remains debated among scholars. The conspirators knew that Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, would be visiting Sarajevo on the 28th of June to observe military maneuvers. This was to be a state visit, a demonstration of Austro-Hungarian power and authority in Bosnia. To the conspirators, it presented an opportunity that could not be missed. The death of the heir to the throne might shake the foundations of Austro-Hungarian power. It might provoke the empire into overreach, or it might inspire a general uprising of South Slavic peoples. Or perhaps these young men simply wanted to strike a blow against the system that oppressed them, regardless of the consequences. The historical record suggests their thinking was not entirely clear on such matters, driven more by passion and nationalist conviction than by careful strategic calculation. The plot itself was organized by Danilo Ilić, a Bosnian Serb, who served as the coordinator for the assassination attempt. Ilić gathered around him a small group of conspirators. Gavrilo Princip, Nedeljko Čabrinović, and Trifko Grabić were the three primary assassins. These were not hardened revolutionaries, but young men in their late teens and early 20s, driven by idealism and nationalist fervor. Čabrinović was 20 years old, the son of a journalist. Grabić was 18, a Bosnian Serb from a modest background. They were provided with weapons by Serbian contacts, including Browning pistols and hand grenades obtained through Serbian military channels. Whether these weapons came through official Serbian military intelligence or through independent Black Hand networks remains a point of historical debate, but the weapons themselves were of a type commonly used by Serbian forces. The conspirators positioned themselves along the route that Franz Ferdinand's motorcade would take through Sarajevo on the morning of the 28th of June. They waited with their weapons hidden, their hearts pounding, aware that they were about to attempt something that would reverberate through history. The morning was warm and sunny, a pleasant day in Sarajevo. The city was decorated for the occasion, with banners and flags hung throughout the streets. Large crowds gathered to watch the motorcade pass. The Austro-Hungarian authorities had arranged minimal security, confident that a state visit in one of their own cities would proceed without incident. What happened next was a cascade of events so improbable, so filled with chance and coincidence, that some historians have struggled to explain it adequately. The first assassination attempt came as the motorcade made its way through the city streets. Nedeljko Čabrinović threw a hand grenade at the vehicle carrying Franz Ferdinand. The grenade bounced off the car and exploded on the street, injuring several people in the crowd and some members of the Archduke's entourage. Franz Ferdinand himself was unharmed. The Archduke's driver accelerated, and the motorcade sped away from the scene. Čabrinović attempted to poison himself with a cyanide capsule, but vomited it up. He was arrested within minutes. The failed attack should have ended the assassination attempt. The motorcade was now alert and moving rapidly. Security had been increased. The logical course would have been for Franz Ferdinand to leave the city immediately or to cancel the rest of his schedule. Instead, remarkably, the Archduke insisted on continuing with the planned itinerary. He would visit the governor of Bosnia to express his continued confidence in Austro-Hungarian rule despite the attack. This decision would prove fateful. What followed was one of the most extraordinary coincidences in history. As the motorcade made its way through the city's streets toward the governor's residence, the driver became confused about the correct route. The vehicle turned down a side street, the Apple Quay, a street that happened to run past a small delicatessen shop. Standing outside that shop, still holding his pistol, was Gavrilo Princip. The conspirator had positioned himself along the original planned route, but had not expected the motorcade to deviate. Now, by the most improbable accident, the vehicle carrying the Archduke was passing directly in front of him. Princip did not hesitate. He stepped into the street and fired 2 shots from his Browning pistol. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The second struck Sophie, Franz Ferdinand's wife, in the abdomen. The Archduke cried out, and within moments, both he and the Duchess were dead. Princip attempted to shoot himself, but was overpowered by the crowd before he could complete the act. He was arrested and taken into custody. The assassination had succeeded, but only through a series of events so improbable that they seem almost fictional. The conspirators had positioned themselves along the original route. The motorcade had been diverted due to driver error. Princip had remained at his position despite the failed grenade attack. The vehicle had slowed as it turned the corner. Every element had aligned in a way that made the successful assassination possible. Historians have spent decades analyzing this sequence of events, debating the role of chance, of planning, of luck, both good and ill. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was one of shock and confusion. News of the deaths spread through Sarajevo and then through Europe. In Vienna, the Imperial government received the news with a combination of grief and fury. Franz Ferdinand, despite his limitations and his controversial views, had been the heir to the throne. His death was not merely a personal tragedy, but a profound shock to the Austro-Hungarian state. The empire's leadership immediately sought to determine who was responsible and whether the Serbian government had been involved in the plot. The investigation into the assassination was pursued with intensity. Gavrilo Princip and the other conspirators were arrested and interrogated. The weapons were traced back to Serbian sources. Documents were discovered suggesting connections to Serbian military intelligence. The evidence, though not conclusive, pointed toward at least some level of Serbian involvement or knowledge of the plot. Whether the Serbian government itself had authorized the assassination, or whether elements within Serbian intelligence had acted independently, remained unclear. The Austro-Hungarian government, however, increasingly convinced that Serbia was responsible, began to contemplate a military response. The weeks following the assassination saw a rapid escalation of tensions. Austria-Hungary, supported by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia on the 23rd of July. The ultimatum demanded that Serbia suppress nationalist organizations, allow Austro-Hungarian officials to operate within Serbian territory to investigate the assassination, and accept other humiliating conditions. The Serbian government, supported by Russia, rejected the most objectionable demands. Austria-Hungary, determined to use the assassination as an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all, declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July. What followed was the cascade of mobilizations that transformed a regional conflict into a continental war. Russia, bound by nationalist sentiment and strategic interests to support Serbia, began mobilization. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, demanded that Russia cease mobilization and then declared war on Russia on the 1st of August. France, allied with Russia, mobilized its forces. Germany, seeking to attack France before Russian forces could fully mobilize, invaded Belgium on the 4th of August, bringing Britain into the war as well. Within weeks, the great powers of Europe were locked in a continental conflict that would reshape the world. The 5 mistakes that would be traced back to the assassination in Sarajevo were thus set in motion. The first mistake was the decision to visit Sarajevo despite known security risks and nationalist tensions. The second was the inadequate security arrangements for the visit. The third was the decision to continue the schedule despite the failed grenade attack. The fourth was the driver's confusion that led the motorcade down the fateful side street. The fifth was the Austro-Hungarian decision to use the assassination as justification for war against Serbia, a decision that triggered the alliance system and brought the great powers into conflict. Each of these mistakes, individually, might have been survivable. Together, they created a chain of events that led to the First World War. The assassination in Sarajevo was not inevitable, not predetermined by deep historical forces, but rather the product of chance, poor judgment, and the volatile political situation of the Balkans. Yet, once it had occurred, the diplomatic and military machinery of Europe's great powers began to move inexorably toward war. The decisions made in the days and weeks following the assassination would determine whether the conflict would remain regional or become continental, whether it would be brief or protracted, whether it would be contained or would consume the entire European order. The morning of June the 28th, 1914, dawned clear and warm across Sarajevo. The city had prepared meticulously for the visit of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The streets were lined with schoolchildren clutching small flags. Military units in dress uniforms stood at attention along the planned route. The local authorities believed they had taken every necessary precaution. They had not. In the weeks preceding the Archduke's arrival, the conspiracy had taken shape with deliberate precision. The Black Hand, that secret organization founded in Belgrade in May of 1911 by Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijević and other Serbian military officers, had set its machinery in motion. The organization's constitution and internal manifestos, though never published as a formal philosophical treatise, revealed an ideology rooted in South Slavic nationalism and the dream of Yugoslav unification. The Black Hand saw in Franz Ferdinand's visit not merely a diplomatic occasion, but an opportunity to strike at the heart of Austro-Hungarian authority in the Balkans, an opportunity that might ignite the broader conflict that Serbian nationalists believed inevitable. Gavrilo Princip, the young Bosnian Serb who would become the instrument of history's pivot point, had been selected for this task. He was 20 years old, thin and intense, a schoolboy turned revolutionary. His journey from Sarajevo to Belgrade to receive instruction and weapons represented one of the 5 critical mistakes that would reshape the world. The Serbian military intelligence apparatus, operating with the tacit approval of elements within the Serbian government, had provided him and his fellow conspirators with weapons and training. They had not adequately considered the consequences of their actions, nor had they developed contingency plans for the moment when their plot succeeded. Princip had traveled to Belgrade with fellow conspirators Nedeljko Čabrinović and Trifko Grabić. There, they met with members of the Black Hand, including the organization's leader, Apis himself. The conspirators received Browning pistols, hand grenades manufactured in Serbia, and cyanide capsules intended for use after the assassination. These were not the weapons of desperate amateurs. These were instruments provided by a state apparatus, however deniably. This represented the second critical error, the involvement of official Serbian military structures in what should have remained a matter of individual revolutionary commitment. The line between nationalist conspiracy and state-sponsored assassination had been deliberately blurred, and this ambiguity would prove catastrophic. The conspirators returned to Sarajevo in late May and early June, positioning themselves along the Archduke's planned route. 6 men were stationed at various points throughout the city. Their mission was clear: assassinate Franz Ferdinand during his official visit. The plan itself contained significant flaws. Communication between the conspirators was uncertain. The exact timing of the Archduke's movements remained somewhat unpredictable. The conspirators had not established clear protocols for what would happen if one attempt failed and another succeeded. Yet despite these tactical weaknesses, The conspiracy proceeded. On the morning of June the 28th, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, traveled through Sarajevo in an open motor car. The choice of an open vehicle was itself a third critical mistake, a decision made by security officials who believed the city adequately pacified and the threat level minimal. The route was known in advance. The timing was public. Every element of the visit had been announced through official channels. At approximately 10 in the morning, the first conspirator made his move. Nedeljko Chabrinovic, positioned along the Apple Quay, hurled a hand grenade at the Archduke's vehicle. The grenade bounced off the canvas canopy and detonated beneath the following car, injuring 2 members of the Archduke's entourage. The explosion sent a shock through the motorcade. Security personnel immediately surrounded the Archduke's vehicle. Chabrinovic, believing his moment had come, attempted to swallow his cyanide capsule and then threw himself into the Miljacka River below. The poison failed to work. The river, running low in the summer heat, did not drown him. He was captured, and the conspiracy's existence was immediately revealed to the authorities. This first attempt's failure created a critical juncture. The Archduke's security detail faced a crucial decision. They could abandon the visit, return to the residence, and cancel the remaining engagements. Many officials urged exactly this course of action. Yet Franz Ferdinand, displaying the stubbornness that had characterized much of his life, insisted that the visit continue. The fourth critical mistake had been made. The decision to proceed with the schedule despite an attempted assassination. The motorcade was reorganized. The Archduke and his wife continued through the city streets, now traveling at increased speed and with heightened security. Yet as the vehicles navigated the narrow streets of Sarajevo, an extraordinary sequence of events unfolded. The motorcade took a wrong turn, deviating from the planned route. The vehicles slowed as the drivers attempted to correct their course. At this precise moment, by an accident of geography and timing that would reshape the 20th century, Gavrilo Princip found himself standing directly in front of the Archduke's car. Princip had positioned himself outside a delicatessen on Franz Joseph Street, uncertain whether another attempt would even be possible after Chabrinovic's failure and capture. He had heard the explosion earlier and assumed the plot had failed. The conspiracy seemed finished, yet now, impossibly, the Archduke's vehicle was moving slowly directly toward him. The opportunity that Princip had traveled to Belgrade to pursue, the mission for which he had been armed and trained by the Black Hands network, suddenly materialized before him in the space of seconds. Princip drew his Browning pistol. The weapon was a 7.65mm model, capable of firing multiple rounds in rapid succession. He stepped forward and fired twice at point-blank range. The first bullet struck the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The second struck his wife Sophie in the abdomen. Both were mortally wounded. The shots that killed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife were fired in broad daylight on a city street, witnessed by dozens of people. The conspiracy, despite its failures and near collapse, had achieved its central objective. Princip attempted to use his cyanide capsule, but, like Chabrinovic's, it failed to work. He attempted to shoot himself with his remaining bullets, but was subdued by the crowd and security personnel before he could succeed. He was captured alive, as was Chabrinovic. The conspiracy's members were arrested over the following days and weeks. They would be tried, convicted, and imprisoned. Several would die in captivity during the war. Yet their central act had been accomplished. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was dead. This assassination represented the fifth critical mistake. The failure of Serbian officials and the Black Hands leadership to recognize that successfully killing the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne would not spark a Balkan revolution or Serbian triumph, but rather would trigger a catastrophic chain of events leading to world war. The conspirators and their supporters had believed that such an act might provoke internal collapse within Austria-Hungary or inspire South Slavic uprisings. They had not adequately calculated that Austria-Hungary would interpret the assassination as an act of Serbian state aggression and would respond with ultimatums and military action. The immediate aftermath of the assassination unfolded with grim inevitability. The Austro-Hungarian government launched an investigation into the conspiracy's origins. Within days, the connection to Serbian military intelligence became apparent. On July the 23rd, Austria-Hungary issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia, demanding that Serbian officials participate in investigating the assassination, that Serbia suppress nationalist organizations, and that Serbia accept Austro-Hungarian participation in the investigation on Serbian soil. These demands were designed to be unacceptable to Serbian pride and sovereignty. Serbia's response came on July 25th. The Serbian government rejected the most objectionable portions of the ultimatum, particularly those that would have allowed Austro-Hungarian officials to operate within Serbian territory. This rejection provided Austria-Hungary with the pretext it required. On July the 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The diplomatic crisis that had simmered beneath the surface of European politics for years suddenly erupted into open military conflict. Yet the assassination's consequences extended far beyond the Austro-Serbian conflict. The alliance system that had structured European great power politics for decades now activated in sequence. Russia, bound to Serbia by Slavic solidarity and strategic interest in the Balkans, began mobilizing its military forces. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary through the dual alliance established in 1899, mobilized in response to Russian mobilization. France, bound to Russia through the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, began mobilizing as well. Germany, facing a two-front war if both Russia and France mobilized, made the strategic decision to attack France through Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. Within a matter of weeks, the great powers of Europe had transformed a regional Balkan conflict into a continental war. The cascade of mobilizations proceeded with mechanical precision. On July 30th, Russia ordered general mobilization. On July 31st, Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia demanding the cessation of mobilization and an ultimatum to France demanding neutrality. Russia did not respond satisfactorily. France refused to commit to neutrality. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. The five mistakes: the involvement of Serbian military intelligence, the blurred lines between conspiracy and state action, the choice of an open motor car for the Archduke's route, the decision to continue the visit after the first assassination attempt, and the failure to anticipate the catastrophic consequences of successfully assassinating the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had set in motion a chain of events that would consume the world. The assassination in Sarajevo did not cause World War I in any simple deterministic sense. The underlying tensions, the alliance systems, the arms races, the imperial competition, and the nationalist fervor had all been building for years. Yet, the assassination provided the spark that ignited the powder keg. It transformed abstract diplomatic tensions into concrete military action. It forced decision-makers to move from theoretical contingency planning to actual mobilization. It created the immediate, urgent crisis that shattered the calculations of those who believed war could be controlled or limited. Gavrilo Princip, imprisoned after his capture, would live to see the war he had helped initiate transform the world. He would die in an Austro-Hungarian prison in 1918, just as the war was ending. He never witnessed the outcome of his actions: the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the creation of Yugoslavia, or the emergence of new nation-states from the rubble of old empires. He never witnessed the 16 million deaths, the reshaping of European borders, or the economic devastation that would scar the continent for generations. Yet his bullets had set all of these consequences in motion. The Black Hand's leadership similarly failed to anticipate the consequences of their actions. Some members of the organization would be purged by Serbian authorities who sought to distance themselves from the assassination. Others would survive the war and see the nationalist dreams they had pursued partially realized in the creation of Yugoslavia, yet none of them had truly comprehended that successfully assassinating one archduke would lead to the deaths of millions and the transformation of the entire global order. The turning point had arrived. The crisis that European diplomats had feared and anticipated for years was suddenly upon them. The mechanisms of alliance, mobilization, and military planning that had been developed in careful detail now activated. The armies that had been trained and equipped for years of preparation now began to move. The young men who had been conscripted or enlisted now departed for training camps and deployment. The civilians who had lived in relative peace now faced the prospect of total war. The world that had existed on June 27, 1914, was gone forever. The shot that rang out on the Latin Bridge in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914 was heard not merely in that provincial Austro-Hungarian city, but echoed across the entire continent of Europe. In the moment that Gavrilo Princip fired his pistol, killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, he believed he was striking a blow for Serbian liberation. What he had actually done was ignite a fuse that would detonate the carefully balanced system of European alliances and plunge the world into unprecedented catastrophe. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was one of shock and confusion. Princip, barely 20 years old, was seized by police within minutes. Wounded from his own suicide attempt, interrogated relentlessly, he would eventually confess his role and implicate his fellow conspirators. The other members of the assassination team scattered through the streets of Sarajevo, some fleeing into the countryside, others captured and imprisoned. Nedeljko Čabrinović, who had thrown the bomb that morning, was apprehended after jumping into the Miljaka River. Trifko Grabež, the third gunman, was also taken into custody. The conspiracy that had seemed so carefully orchestrated unraveled within hours, its secrets spilling out to Austro-Hungarian authorities, who were determined to extract every detail. But while the conspirators faced interrogation in Sarajevo's jails, something far more consequential was unfolding in the halls of power across Europe. In Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian government immediately concluded that Serbia bore responsibility for the assassination. This conclusion was not entirely unreasonable. The conspirators were Bosnian Serbs, and the weapons and support had come from Serbia through the Black Hand organization. However, what the Austro-Hungarian leadership did not yet understand was that the Serbian government itself, under Prime Minister Nikola Pasic, had actually attempted to prevent the assassination. Serbian officials had learned of the plot and tried to warn Vienna, though their warnings were vague and never reached the Archduke before his fateful drive through Sarajevo. The Austro-Hungarian government, however, saw an opportunity. For years, the empire had viewed Serbian nationalism as an existential threat to its multi-ethnic structure. The Balkans Wars of 1912 and 1913 had demonstrated Serbian military strength and ambition. Now, with the heir to the throne assassinated, the Austro-Hungarian leadership believed they had justification to crush Serbian independence once and for all. Count Leopold Berchtold, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, and General Franz Conrad von Hertzendorf, the chief of the general staff, began advocating for military action against Serbia. The diplomatic crisis that followed unfolded with terrible inevitability. On the 23rd of July, 1914, exactly 25 days after the assassination, Austria-Hungary presented Serbia with an ultimatum. The document contained 10 demands, many of which were designed to be unacceptable to any sovereign nation. Serbia was required to suppress anti-Austro-Hungarian nationalist organizations, to allow Austro-Hungarian officials to operate within Serbian territory, to investigate the assassination, and to dismiss officials deemed hostile to Austria-Hungary. The ultimatum was presented with a 48-hour deadline for acceptance. The Serbian government, under intense pressure, and aware that rejection meant war, accepted 9 of the 10 demands. The single demand they rejected involved allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to conduct investigations within Serbian territory, which they argued violated Serbian sovereignty. This technicality, however, provided Austria-Hungary with the justification it sought. On the 28th of July, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. What followed was a cascade of mobilizations that transformed a regional conflict into a continental war. The alliance system that had been carefully constructed over decades now operated like a system of dominoes. Russia, bound by pan-Slavic sympathies and strategic interests in the Balkans, began mobilizing its armies to support Serbia. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary through the dual alliance, viewed Russian mobilization as a threat and demanded that Russia cease its military preparations. When Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia on the 1st of August, 1914. Germany's strategic doctrine, known as the Schlieffen Plan, required rapid action against France before Russia could fully mobilize. The plan called for a massive offensive through Belgium to knock France out of the war quickly, preventing Germany from fighting a two-front war. On the 2nd of August, Germany demanded that Belgium allow German armies to pass through its territory. Belgium, bound by international treaties to remain neutral, refused. Germany invaded Belgium on the 4th of August, and Britain, committed by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany that same day. Within a span of mere weeks, the great powers of Europe had all taken up arms. What had begun as a regional crisis in the Balkans had transformed into a general European war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had set in motion a chain of events that no one fully controlled and few could have predicted in their entirety. The delicate balance of power that had maintained relative peace for more than 40 years since the Franco-Prussian War had shattered irreparably. The 5 mistakes that had contributed to this catastrophic outcome now revealed their full significance. First, the Austro-Hungarian military's inadequate security arrangements had created the opportunity for assassination. Second, the failure of Serbian authorities to effectively communicate their warning to Vienna had left the Archduke vulnerable, despite knowledge of the threat. Third, the driver's wrong turn onto the Latin Bridge had placed Franz Ferdinand directly in front of Gavrilo Princip at the precise moment when Princip had lost all hope of another opportunity. Fourth, the Austro-Hungarian government's decision to interpret the assassination as justification for war against Serbia had transformed a tragedy into a casus belli. Fifth, the rigid alliance system and military mobilization schedules had made it nearly impossible for diplomatic solutions to take hold once the machinery of war had begun to turn. The soldiers who marched to war in August 1914 carried with them the expectations of quick victory and triumphant return. Austro-Hungarian regiments mobilized to fight Serbia, confident that they would crush the smaller nation within weeks. German armies advanced through Belgium and into France, anticipating that the war would be decided before winter. Russian forces mobilized to support Serbia and to defend against German aggression. French armies took up defensive positions, British forces deployed to support their French allies. The mobilization was total and unprecedented in its scale. Yet the war that unfolded was nothing like what the military planners had anticipated. The conflict that was supposed to be resolved in months stretched into years. The trenches that appeared on the Western Front became symbols of a new kind of warfare, one of attrition and stalemate, rather than rapid maneuver and decisive victory. Millions of soldiers from all the combatant nations would die in the muddy fields of France and Flanders, in the mountains of the Eastern Front, and in countless other theaters of war. The Austro-Hungarian army, despite its initial mobilization against Serbia, would find itself locked in a grinding struggle on multiple fronts, unable to achieve the quick victory that its leaders had anticipated. Gavrilo Princip, imprisoned in Sarajevo, would not live to see the end of the war he had helped to start. Suffering from tuberculosis and the harsh conditions of his captivity, he died in prison in 1918. Just as the war was reaching its conclusion, he was buried in an unmarked grave, a forgotten figure in the vast tragedy he had set in motion. The other conspirators faced various fates. Nedeljko Čabrinović died in prison in 1916. Trifko Grabež also perished in captivity. The members of the Black Hand who had orchestrated the conspiracy from Belgrade faced their own reckoning as Serbia struggled to survive the war. The legacy of the assassination extended far beyond the immediate outbreak of war. The conflict that began in 1914 would reshape the entire map of Europe and fundamentally alter the course of the 20th century. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, weakened by years of war on multiple fronts, would collapse in 1918. The Russian Empire would be overthrown by revolution in 1917, leading to the creation of the Soviet Union. The German Empire would be defeated and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, creating resentments that would fester for decades. France would emerge victorious but exhausted. Britain would retain its power but at an enormous cost. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand thus represented a pivotal moment in human history. It was not inevitable that the death of one man should lead to the deaths of millions. Many historians have argued that the war would have come eventually regardless of the assassination, that the underlying tensions and contradictions within the European system made conflict inevitable. Others have suggested that without the assassination, war might have been avoided or at least delayed. The truth, as is often the case with historical causation, is complex and multifaceted. What can be stated with certainty is that the assassination revealed the fragility of the European order. The great powers had constructed a system of alliances and agreements designed to maintain peace through the balance of power. Yet this system contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The rigid mobilization schedules of the military powers meant that once one nation began to prepare for war, others felt compelled to do the same. The alliance system meant that a conflict between two nations could quickly expand to involve all the great powers. The nationalism that gripped the various peoples of Europe meant that diplomatic compromises were often politically impossible. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand provided the spark that ignited these underlying tensions. In the decades following the First World War, historians and political leaders would debate endlessly about responsibility for the war. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly assigned war guilt to Germany, a decision that would have profound consequences for European politics in the 1920s and 1930s. Yet, scholars have shown that responsibility was far more widely distributed than the treaty suggested. Austria-Hungary's aggressive response to the assassination, Germany's support for that response, Russia's decision to mobilize, France's commitment to support Russia, and Britain's determination to defend Belgian neutrality. All of these decisions contributed to the outbreak of war. The assassination also revealed the power of individual action in history. Gavrilo Princip was a young man of limited resources and modest education. Yet his actions, combined with the decisions of political leaders across Europe, changed the course of history. This has led many historians and philosophers to reflect on the relationship between individual agency and historical forces. Were the great powers destined to go to war, or did Princip's bullets divert history from a different path? The question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What is clear is that the First World War, which killed more than 17 million people, transformed the world. The war destroyed the old European order and created the conditions for the Second World War. The Russian Revolution, which occurred during the First World War, created the Soviet Union and set the stage for the Cold War that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. The harsh peace that followed the First World War created resentments in Germany that would be exploited by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The decolonization movements that would reshape the global order in the mid-20th century were accelerated by the First World War and its aftermath. Sarajevo itself, the city where the assassination occurred, would become a symbol of the destructive power of ethnic and nationalist conflict. In 1992, 78 years after the start of the First World War, Sarajevo would again become the center of a brutal conflict as Yugoslavia dissolved and ethnic tensions erupted into violence. The city that had witnessed the beginning of one world war would witness the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era of regional conflicts. The 5 mistakes that led to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand thus echo through the 20th century and into the 21st. They remind us of how contingent history can be, how the failure of security measures or the wrong turn of a driver can have consequences that ripple across decades. They also remind us of the importance of diplomatic communication, of the dangers of rigid alliance systems, and of the catastrophic potential of nationalism and ethnic conflict. The assassination in Sarajevo was not merely a moment in history, but a turning point that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. The soldiers who marched to war in 1914 believed they were fighting for their nations, for their honor, for their futures. Few of them could have imagined the horror that awaited them in the trenches. The promises of quick victory gave way to years of grinding attrition. The technology of modern warfare, machine guns, artillery, poison gas, tanks, created killing fields on an unprecedented scale. The First World War introduced industrial-scale death to human conflict, a grim innovation that would define the 20th century. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of the assassination and the war it triggered is the lesson it teaches about the fragility of peace and the importance of understanding history. The European powers that went to war in 1914 believed they understood the stakes and the likely outcomes. They were catastrophically wrong. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914 continued until 1918, and the peace that followed was unstable and temporary. The second global conflict that would begin in 1939 was, in many ways, a continuation of the first. As we look back on the assassination in Sarajevo, we see not merely a historical event, but a warning. The 5 mistakes that enabled it, inadequate security, failed communication, chance circumstance, aggressive diplomacy, and rigid alliance structures, remain relevant to contemporary international relations. The nationalism that drove Gavrilo Princip and the Serbian conspirators continues to drive conflicts around the world. The alliance systems and military preparations that transformed a regional crisis into a global war still shape international politics. The lessons of 1914 remain urgent and vital, reminding us that history can turn on small moments, that individual actions matter, and that the consequences of our choices can echo across generations. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning about this incredible chapter of World War I history. If you found this video valuable, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of this period fascinates you most? Your perspectives really help shape the videos I create next. Trust me, we've got so many more fascinating stories to explore together. The Great War changed our world in countless ways, and there's always more to discover. So keep watching, stay curious, and keep learning. See you next time.